If you've ever dreamed of owning a log cabin tucked in the woods, the smell of pine in the morning, the soft creak of timbers as the wind rolls through, you probably imagine something eternal, solid, built to last forever. But here's the strange truth. Most modern log homes, even the ones that cost a fortune, begin to rot within a few years. The chinking cracks, the logs darken with mold, and a damp smell seeps into the walls like a warning from nature itself. Yet scattered across the wild country of the Rockies and the northern plains, there still stand tiny, weather-beaten cabins, built nearly 2 centuries ago by men with nothing but an axe, a hatchet, and a handful of days to spare, and somehow they endure. They lean a little, their roofs sag, but they remain alive, dry, breathing, defying time. What did those mountain men know that we've forgotten? What ancient understanding of wood, weather, and decay allowed their crude shelters to outlast our engineered masterpieces? Tonight, we're going to find out. So settle in, let the fire crackle low, and listen. Because this is not just the story of a cabin, it's the story of a forgotten language between man and nature, and how we lost it. The mountain man of legend. The lone trapper, coat of furs, musket in hand, cabin glowing beneath the pines, is one of America's most enduring myths. But like most myths, it's only half true. The real mountain man didn't build a sprawling 2-story lodge with a grand stone hearth and a wide porch to greet the sunrise. His world didn't allow that kind of comfort. His cabin, if you could even call it that, was a crude little thing, barely 90 square feet, small enough for one man to sleep, cook, and store his pelts. It wasn't built to impress, it was built to survive. Imagine it. You've been traveling for weeks, following your trapline through snow and forest, your supplies running low, your breath freezing in the night air. You come upon a clearing near a stream, sheltered from the wind, close to water, dry underfoot. Here, you'll build your tilt. No nails, no saws, no blueprint, just instinct and experience. You start with the trees that nature gives you, green logs, still wet with sap, their bark clinging tight. You fell them with your axe, trim the limbs, and drag them into place. Each log is a gamble too heavy, and it'll crack too dry, and it'll rot. But you don't think in terms of failure, you think in terms of rhythm, of what feels right. The cabin rises fast, not like a house, but like a heartbeat. The walls grow with every swing, rough and uneven but strong. And above it all, the roof tilts low, slanting in one direction, a single pitch that lets the rain and snow slide away. This was the trapper's tilt, a marvel of wilderness engineering born not of design but of necessity. The trick was simple. When stacking the logs, you placed the thick ends all to one side, creating a natural slope. The roof would then shed the weather and catch the heat of the fire, keeping you alive through the long frozen months. It was a home that breathed with you. Every creak, every hiss of smoke from the fire pit, every draft that found its way through the cracks, reminding you that you were part of the wilderness, not apart from it. No foundation, no insulation, no preservatives or concrete anchors, just wood, clay, moss, and an understanding that the forest, if respected, would protect you. These cabins were never meant to last forever. They were built to last long enough. Yet here we are, nearly 2 centuries later, and many of those rough, hand-hewn shelters still stand, outliving the men who built them, and even the modern homes that tried to imitate them. So what was their secret? How did they know how to work with nature, when we, with all our science, build against it? The answer, like the cabins themselves, is buried in the logs, in the way they notched, stacked, and sealed them. The secret lies not in what they built, but how they thought. If you asked a modern log home builder how to notch a cabin, they'd probably talk for hours about precision, symmetry, and water shedding. They'd pull out diagrams and levels, maybe even a laser. They'd explain how the notches must always face downward, so rain can't collect, and how every joint must be tight enough to block even the smallest draft. It's science, they'd say, and maybe they're right. But the mountain men, the trappers who built with nothing but an axe and instinct, would have laughed at such rules, because their cabins didn't just survive the weather, they outlasted it. The truth is, the old trappers did something almost no modern builder would dare to do. They notched their logs on the top. To the trained eye of today's craftsman, that's a fatal mistake. A top notch is a basin waiting to fill with rain, a cradle for rot, but to the mountain man, the problem was never water, it was trapped water. He understood what the wilderness had taught him. Wood is alive and so is moisture. It must move, breathe, come and go. So instead of sealing everything tight, he allowed nature to flow through the structure. He didn't build against decay, he built with it. Picture the process. A green cedar log lies across two others. The trapper kneels beside it, snow melting on his shoulders. He marks the width of the lower log with the edge of his axe, then chops a V-shaped groove straight down into the top. Chips fly, echoing through the forest. In just a few minutes, the notch is deep enough. No measuring, no sanding, no delicate joinery. He flips the log, drives a wooden peg through the notch, and the fit is snug, not perfect but alive, a system that shifts, tightens, and seals itself over time. Each log settles into the one beneath it, compressing as the wood dries. The bark still clings, helping to shed rain while letting the log breathe. With every passing season, the joints grow tighter, the gaps narrower. The cabin doesn't remain static. It changes. It contracts in winter's dry cold, expands again with spring thaw, and every motion makes it stronger. To modern eyes, this method looks crude, even careless, but it was a design born of experience, of trial and error in places where mistakes could kill. These men didn't have kilns or preservatives or sealants. What they had was an understanding of rhythm and time. Green logs weren't a flaw, they were a strategy. Fresh wood is soft, easy to cut, forgiving, and as it seasons it shrinks, locking the cabin together tighter than any nail or screw could manage. It's strange, isn't it? We've spent centuries trying to master the art of permanence, inventing glues, varnishes, paints to hold nature still. But these men knew that nothing living can be permanent. The forest shifts, the ground freezes and thaws, and even a cabin must learn to bend. The mountain man's genius wasn't in resisting decay, but in understanding it. When the first walls rose, they weren't perfect, but they were honest, rough, human, and built with the kind of respect only hardship can teach. Every axe stroke held a small wager against the wild, and every log fit into place not just by hand but by instinct. He didn't build for beauty, he built for survival, and yet in that brutal efficiency, in that top-notch no architect would ever sign off on, he found a kind of grace that modern construction has forgotten. Because his goal wasn't to create something flawless, it was to create something that endures. The roof of a mountain man's cabin was never just a roof, it was a creature, alive, layered, breathing in rhythm with the woods around it. Modern builders talk about barriers, about sealing and waterproofing, about keeping nature out. But the mountain man knew better. He knew that you can't keep nature out. Not in the Rockies, not in the frozen high plains, not when the wind itself howls like a living thing. So instead of fighting the elements, he invited them in on his own terms. He began with poles, straight, slender tamarack or pine, laid across the top of the log walls like ribs. No saws, no metal fasteners, just balance and instinct. They extended beyond the cabin's front by a few feet, forming a little overhang, a porch that broke the fall of rain and snow before it could hammer against the doorway. Over those poles he laid wide strips of cedar bark, peeled in the spring when sap ran high and the forest smelled sweet and sharp. That bark, flexible, fibrous and rich with natural oils, became a perfect waterproof membrane. It was the mountain man's version of shingles, laid by hand, pressed by weather, held fast by the weight of earth itself. Because over the bark came the final layer, the heart of the roof, sod, thick, damp, and crawling with life, moss, grass, dirt, scooped from the ground just outside the cabin's walls. He spread it in a heavy blanket across the roof, a living shield against the sky. It weighed hundreds of pounds, and yet it was gentle, absorbing water, muffling wind, insulating the room below. In summer, it kept the heat out. In winter, it held the warmth close. And as rain fell, it soaked up moisture like a sponge, releasing it slowly, never letting the logs beneath stay wet long enough to rot. To a modern eye, it looks primitive, even foolish, but in truth, it was brilliant. This living roof didn't repel water. It managed it. It didn't fight nature. It worked with it. The cabin and its roof formed a delicate breathing ecosystem. Wood and earth and moss cooperating in balance, constantly adjusting to each season's demand. And the walls, they were no less alive. Between the logs, the mountain man packed a strange mixture, part mud, part sand, part grass, sometimes even a little animal hair. This was his chinking, the seal that closed the gaps where wind and snow slipped through. But unlike modern acrylics or synthetic sealants, his chinking wasn't airtight. It wasn't meant to be. It was porous, just enough to let air and moisture pass through. To a man who lived by instinct, this was common sense. If the cabin could breathe, it could live. Trapped moisture is the death of wood. A sealed cabin, no matter how beautiful, will rot from the inside out, but a breathing one, with its earthy walls and living roof, becomes part of the landscape, not resisting decay, but renewing itself through every cycle of rain and sun. Inside, the air would smell faintly of smoke and pine, of bark and damp soil. The fire crackled in the corner, its smoke curling through the gaps until it found its way out through the roof's sod. It was never comfortable by modern standards. It was smoky, uneven, alive, but in that raw simplicity lay its strength. Because the mountain man didn't build for comfort. He built for continuity. Every element, the notches, the green logs, the chinking, the sod roof, was part of a single living system. Each piece supported the others, shifting with time, bending but never breaking. And somehow, through that crude art, those rough hands created something immortal, a home that could stand for centuries, a home that remembered the rhythm of the forest better than any machine or blueprint ever could. When we look back at those old cabins now, the ones half buried in snow, standing crooked in a meadow that hasn't seen a soul in 50 years, we see relics, symbols of a harder time. We admire their rough charm, take photographs of them at sunset, maybe even build replicas with machine-milled logs and polished floors. But what we don't see, what we've forgotten, is the mindset behind them. Because the mountain man wasn't just building a shelter, he was building a conversation with nature. He understood something that we, in our climate-controlled houses, have almost completely lost: that wood is not a material. It's a being. It expands, shrinks, sweats, breathes. To force it still is to kill it. The old trappers knew this. They never built a cabin to resist nature. They built it to move with nature. Every log, every notch, every handful of moss pressed between the cracks was placed with that truth in mind. The result wasn't a structure frozen in time, but one that changed, settling, flexing, aging, the way a living body does. Today we build against the elements. We pour concrete to stop the ground from moving. We coat wood in chemicals to stop it from breathing. We trap air, moisture, and heat in layers of plastic, and then wonder why our homes rot from the inside out. The mountain men had no blueprints, but they understood systems, invisible systems of heat, water, and air. They watched how bark shed rain, how roots held soil, how a fallen tree dried in the sun, and they copied nature's designs without ever writing them down. When a trapper's tilt leaned after a winter storm, he didn't panic. He smiled, because leaning meant movement. Movement meant life. A cabin that never moved was a cabin that was already dying. And there's another kind of wisdom in that. Not just about building, but about living. The same principle that kept their cabins standing, kept their spirits alive, flexibility. You don't survive a mountain winter by trying to control it. You survive by yielding, by adapting, by learning to live inside the rhythm of something far greater than yourself. The mountain men were not engineers or scientists. Most of them couldn't read, but they carried with them an ancient intelligence, the kind that's learned through skin and bone, through frostbite and exhaustion, through watching the world long enough to understand that survival isn't about control, it's about respect. And perhaps that's why those simple cabins built in haste still stand today. Their sod roofs now covered in grass, their notches still tight, their walls still whispering with the breath of time. They remind us of something we once knew but forgot, that the best things we build aren't those we fight nature to preserve, but those we allow to belong to nature. So the next time you see one of those lonely cabins standing against the skyline, don't see a ruin. See a masterpiece of humility. See the proof that survival doesn't come from mastery. It comes from understanding. Because those mountain men didn't just build with logs, they built with patience, with reverence, and with the quiet wisdom of the woods themselves. Somewhere high in the Rockies, above the tree line where the wind never really sleeps, there's a cabin that still stands. Nobody knows exactly who built it. The name long forgotten, the tools rusted away, but the workmanship remains, as if the hands that shaped it still linger in the grain of the wood. Its roof sags slightly, the door leans, and moss creeps along the northern wall, but when you step inside, the air is dry, not a hint of mold, not a trace of rot, just the faint sweet smell of pine resin and thyme. Outside, the snowdrifts rise higher each winter. The storms roll through like armies, and yet somehow the cabin endures. Its walls creak in the cold, but they don't crack. The chinking still holds, though made of nothing more than earth and grass. The bark shingles above have become a garden of their own, tiny wildflowers blooming in the soil of the sod roof, feeding on the same rain that was once meant to destroy it. Every part of it, every log, every fiber still does its job. It's not a miracle. It's design. Ancient, intuitive design. The kind that only comes from listening. The mountain man who built it wasn't thinking about architecture. He wasn't trying to impress anyone or create a monument. He just wanted to live through the winter. But in that act of survival, he stumbled into something profound, a balance between human need and natural law. He didn't dominate the wilderness. He became part of it. We like to think of ourselves as smarter now, more advanced, more efficient, but maybe we've mistaken control for wisdom. The mountain man's cabin teaches a lesson we've almost erased, that endurance isn't about building stronger walls, but about building smarter ones. Walls that can flex, roofs that can breathe, systems that don't trap nature out, but allow it to pass through. When you build something that breathes, you give it a kind of soul. You let it participate in the world, not fight against it. You create harmony instead of conflict. That's why these old cabins, built by men who could barely write their names, have lasted longer than the engineered homes of millionaires. They were designed by humility, not pride. If you stand beside one of them on a quiet evening, you can almost hear it breathe, a soft, low groan as the logs settle. The roof shifts, the air sighs between the seams. It's the sound of wood remembering what it came from, the forest, the soil, the storm, and in that sound there's something deeply human too, a reminder that we, like those cabins, were never meant to be sealed off from the world. We were meant to move, to breathe, to bend without breaking. The mountain men are gone, their names lost to snow and silence, but their wisdom lingers, not written in books or blueprints, but in the cabins that still stand against the wind. Each one is a monument to endurance, a whisper from another time, saying that survival was never about strength, It was about understanding. And maybe as we build our lives, our homes, our cities, our futures, that's the lesson we need to remember most. Because the forest hasn't sit forgotten, and the logs, even now, still breathe. If you ever find yourself deep enough into the wild that the nearest road is just a rumor, and the air tastes clean again, stop and listen. Really listen. The silence there isn't empty. It's layered. Beneath the stillness, you can hear the sound of wind combing through the pines, the soft hiss of snow sliding off a roof that's seen more winters than you'll ever live, and somewhere in the distance the steady rhythm of a creek that hasn't frozen in centuries. That's where you'll understand what those mountain men understood, not just about cabins, but about time itself. Time, to them, wasn't an enemy. It was a builder. Every year that passed didn't destroy their shelters. It made them stronger. The logs hardened, the chinking settled, the bark sealed tighter to the frame. Nature didn't fight their work. It finished it. The mountain man didn't leave behind a monument of perfection. He left behind a collaboration with the earth. His cabin aged like a living thing. It cracked, leaned, healed, and endured. When you look at modern homes, shining, perfect, hermetically sealed, they seem proud, almost defiant. But there's fear behind that perfection. A fear of the elements, of change, of decay. The mountain man had no such fear. He expected decay. He planned for it. He saw it as part of the story, part of the life of the wood. That's why his cabins, stripped of polish and pride, still breathe while ours suffocate. He built slow when the world demanded speed. He observed when others planned. He watched how rivers carved their banks and how snow gathered under certain slopes. From that patience came his quiet genius. He didn't draw blueprints, he remembered them, from the earth itself. If you press your hand to the wall of one of those old cabins, the wood feels warm, as though holding the last light of the day inside it. It's rough, scarred, but alive. Every fibre tells a story, not of comfort or luxury, but of endurance. It's the story of a man who built something not to dominate the land, but to belong to it. That's what we've forgotten in our age of progress. The art of belonging. We build to last, but not to fit. We design for control, not for coexistence. And because of that, our creations, no matter how advanced, lack the quiet resilience that those old cabins still carry in their grain. The wind still moves through their gaps, sighing like an old friend. The roof still sprouts with new moss every spring, a patchwork of green rebirth. And in that small, forgotten shelter at the edge of a forest, you can feel a truth older than any civilization, that survival isn't about conquering nature. It's about learning her rhythm. The mountain men never wrote treatises or manuals. Their lessons were whispered in the axe stroke, the tilt of a roof, the softness of moss pressed into a seam. Their knowledge didn't need to be remembered, because the forest itself kept it, stored in the roots and the grain, in the hum of the wind that still circles through the Rockies every evening. And if you listen long enough, you can still hear it, a faint reminder that what's built with understanding doesn't fade, it becomes eternal. There is a strange peace that settles over those old mountain cabins at dusk, when the last light fades behind the ridge and the air cools to stillness. The forest softens, the sky turns a deep, silent blue, and for a brief moment the cabin and the wilderness are indistinguishable, both breathing in rhythm, both carved from the same story. It's in that moment, as shadows blend with the timber walls, that you understand what those mountain men truly left behind. It wasn't just architecture, it was philosophy. They believed in limits, not the kind imposed by weakness, but by wisdom. They knew that a man who tried to fight the mountain would lose, but a man who listened could endure. Their cabins weren't meant to conquer nature. They were meant to coexist with her, small, humble, almost invisible against the vastness of the land. And maybe that's the secret to their endurance. They didn't try to outshine the wilderness. They became part of it. Each cabin was a reflection of its builder's soul, imperfect, scarred, practical but alive. The axe marks on the logs were as individual as fingerprints. The smoke-stained rafters told stories of winters survived, of meals cooked over the same embers that had once warmed frozen hands. Nothing about them was decorative. Every cut, every joint, every layer of mud in the chinking was a conversation between man and wood, and every conversation ended the same way, with respect. When we build now, we think of comfort, efficiency, prestige, but they built for silence, for safety, for the knowledge that when the blizzard came and the wind screamed like a ghost through the valley, their little structure would hold, that it would sway but not fall, that the earth would take care of what was built in good faith. Maybe that's what we've lost. Not the skill to build, but the humility to listen. The mountain men didn't need plans or engineers. Their plans were written in the slope of the valley, the grain of the timber, the way moss grew on the northern side of the trees. They built with the land, not on top of it. When you walk away from one of those ancient cabins, you don't feel pity for its decay. You feel awe. You realize that what you've just seen isn't a ruin, it's a survivor. The walls may bow, the roof may sprout grass, but it still stands. It breathes. It remembers. Because in the end, those mountain men were right. You can't outbuild nature. You can only learn to build with her. And if you listen closely, on a quiet evening when the forest is still, you might hear it. The faint creak of wood, the sigh of wind through the chinks, the sound of a cabin that has learned the secret of time itself. Not fighting, not resisting, just enduring. And in that soft eternal breath lies the last lesson of the woods, that the things we build with patience and humility may one day outlive even our names. If you close your eyes and listen carefully near one of those old cabins, you can almost hear it, the ghostly rhythm of an axe echoing through the trees. A steady, patient sound, not hurried or angry, but deliberate. Thunk, pause, thunk, the sound of a man shaping his world with his own hands, one strike at a time. That rhythm is older than industry, older than blueprints, older than us. It was the heartbeat of the frontier. For those mountain men, that rhythm meant survival. Each swing of the axe carried calculation, not just muscle but awareness. He knew which trees would split cleanly, which ones would twist or splinter. He knew that pine cracked under frost, that cedar bent without breaking, that spruce held steady under snow. This wasn't knowledge taught in books. It was earned, from blisters, from failure, from years of sleeping under the same stars as the forest he shaped. And in that rhythm, something deeper lived: patience. Modern life moves too quickly for patience. We press buttons, we order, we replace. But back then, every cut of the axe was a meditation. Every cabin a dialogue with eternity. The builder worked slowly, not because he wanted to, but because the forest demanded it. You couldn't rush wood. You couldn't force it. You had to understand it. Even when the cabin was done, if you could ever call it done, he didn't look at it as something finished. It was simply begun. He knew the cabin would change without him. The logs would dry, shrink, shift. The moss between them would settle deeper. The roof would sprout life. The earth beneath it would rise and fall with the frost. He built knowing the work would continue. That time itself would become his silent partner. And maybe that's what makes those cabins so haunting today. They're reminders of a kind of craftsmanship that was never about perfection but about relationship. The bond between man, material, and moment. When we see their blackened chimneys and warped doors, we're looking at more than history. We're looking at acceptance. A building that knows it will age and does so gracefully. The echo of that axe is the sound of a philosophy we've forgotten, that to build something truly lasting you must first accept that it will change. That permanence doesn't come from denial of decay, but from working with it. And when the wind sweeps down the valley and brushes the bark of those ancient timbers, the sound that follows isn't just creaking wood, it's an echo, faint but eternal, of every mountain man who ever raised a roof from nothing, who ever trusted his craft to the mercy of the seasons. It sets the sound of effort turned into legacy, of simplicity turned into truth. Of man, wood and wind still speaking to each other after 200 winters. And as the fire dies low inside that cabin, the embers glowing like old memories, the lesson settles into you as quietly as the falling snow outside. That what sits built with patience, purpose and respect for the world that holds it never truly disappears. It just keeps breathing, softly, endlessly, like the forest itself. There comes a moment standing before one of those old cabins when you realize it isn't just a structure left behind by men. It's part of the forest's memory. The moss that crawls along its base, the saplings pushing up through the soil beside it, the birds nesting in the rafters. They aren't reclaiming it. They're keeping it, preserving what remains of a human conversation that once spoke the same language as the trees. When the wind moves through the clearing, the cabin doesn't resist. It groans, gently, as if in acknowledgement. The bark that once lined its roof now lies in the earth below, softened into humus, feeding new growth. Every flake of wood that peels from its beams carries the story forward, decay turned to nourishment. Old timber returning home. The forest doesn't erase what man builds when he builds with respect. It absorbs it. It carries it along. The mountain men didn't think of legacy. They weren't philosophers or romantics. They were men surviving a world that didn't promise them tomorrow. Yet without realizing it, they left behind something more enduring than monuments of marble or steel. They left harmony. Their cabins didn't scar the land. They blended into it slowly, gracefully, until the line between human and nature disappeared entirely. You can almost feel the years stacked in the air, the winters that froze the walls solid, the summers that baked the roof dry, the spring rains that seeped into the chinking and vanished just as quickly. Each season has written itself into the wood grain like the pages of an unwritten book. No ink, no dates, just the story of endurance told in silence. Sometimes, if you lean close to the wall, you'll find initials carved in the wood, faded, shallow, almost erased by time. The hand that carved them is long gone, but the mark remains. It's the most human thing about the cabin, a whisper from someone who once stood where you're standing, someone who built not for fame or glory, but for warmth, for safety, for one more night against the cold. And the forest has kept that whisper safe. It doesn't shout, doesn't boast. It simply remembers, because that's what the earth does when we meet it halfway. It holds our story, not as an invasion, but as a promise. One day, the last of those cabins will finally collapse. The roof will sink, the logs will settle into the soil, and the spot will vanish beneath ferns and roots. But that won't be an ending. It'll be a return. The trees that grow from that soil will carry within them the strength of the beams that came before. And if someone cuts one of those trees down 100 years from now to build a new home, they'll be working with the same wood, the same atoms, the same wisdom reborn, because the forest remembers everything that's built with reverence. It remembers every axe stroke made in humility. It remembers every roof that chose to breathe rather than resist. And so, long after the last name is forgotten, long after the cabins have melted back into the soil, the knowledge remains, written not in books or blueprints, but in the quiet pulse of the woods. The mountain men are gone. Their fires are cold. But their spirit, the one that built with patience, that endured through snow and silence, still hums beneath the roots, waiting for someone to listen again. Because the forest never forgets what was built with understanding. It simply waits for us to remember. When the sun dips behind the ridges and the world turns the colour of ash, there's a hush that settles across the forest, a quiet so deep you can hear your own heart move. That's when you begin to understand why the mountain men stayed. Not for gold, not for glory, but for that silence. For that feeling that you and the earth share the same breath. And inside those cabins, that silence was always broken by the same small, eternal sound, the crackle of fire against wood. To the untrained ear, it was just warmth. But to the man who built that fire, who split those logs, who knew every grain and knot of the wood by touch, it was communion, The tree he felled in spring now burned in winter, returning its energy to the hands that shaped it. The same pine that once shaded his roof now kept his bones alive through the frost. And when the embers glowed red in the hearth, it wasn't destruction, it was completion, the final cycle of life returning to life. The mountain man didn't waste a thing. The same axe that raised his walls split his kindling. The same bark that once sealed his roof lined the inside of his boots. Everything was part of a single circle. That's what he understood, that the world doesn't give or take. It trades. You give your labor, your sweat, your trust, and in return the wilderness shelters you, feeds you, forgives you. He must have known, sitting there by the firelight, that nothing he built would last forever. The snow would come, the roof would sag, the logs would grey with age. But that didn't bother him, because permanence wasn't the goal, participation was. To build something honest, something that belonged to the world rather than standing apart from it, was enough. When he looked into those flames, maybe he saw the reflection of the forest, dancing, restless, alive. The cabin creaked softly, the logs shifting in the heat, the air breathing through the chinks. It was never still, never perfect, but it lived. And that's what we've forgotten, that imperfection is the price of life, that every structure, every creation, every act of endurance carries its own slow-burning fire inside, the warmth that comes not from sealing ourselves off, but from staying open to the world. The modern builder tries to stop time. He coats, insulates, preserves, and in doing so he smothers the flame. But the mountain man let it burn. The fire in the hearth, the fire in the wood, the fire of being part of something greater than himself. If you stand inside one of those old cabins at night, you can almost feel that heat still lingering in the walls, deep in the grain, as if the wood remembers being both tree and flame. The warmth is faint, but it's there, patient, steady, alive. Because even after the roof caves in, after the forest reclaims what was borrowed, something endures, not the structure, not the man, but the relationship. The dialogue between creator and creation, the understanding that nothing we make belongs only to us. That's the real fire inside the wood, the one that never burns out, the one that keeps whispering century after century to anyone still willing to listen. Build with care, build with humility, and what you build will never truly die. Long after the men are gone, the forest still remembers their hands. You can see it in the way the logs were cut, the way each notch fits the next like a breath drawn and released. Even when the roof has fallen in and the moss has taken root across the floor, the lines of those hands are still there, preserved in the angle of the axe marks, in the gentle taper of a beam, in the care taken not to wound the wood more than was necessary. Those hands were not just labouring, they were listening. Imagine the first light of morning touching that small cabin after a night of snow. The frost glitters on the bark. The air is sharp and silence presses close. The man inside stirs the ashes, coaxing a little warmth from the embers. His hands are rough, cracked, and burned from years of work. Yet when they rest on the logs, they do so with reverence, because he knows these timbers are not his to command, they're his to respect. Every cabin began with an act of faith. A man stood before the wilderness, alone, armed with almost nothing, and believed he could shape something that would endure, not through dominance, but through partnership. He took what he needed and gave back through care, through precision, through patience. Each notch he carved wasn't a wound, but a joining. Every cut carried the understanding that wood remembers how it's treated. Handle it with greed, and it splits. Handle it with humility, and it holds. The mountain men didn't write their wisdom in journals. They wrote it in motion, in the way they swung an axe, balanced a beam, placed their trust in a green log that would one day shrink and seal itself tighter with time. They left behind lessons that can't be spoken, only felt through the grain of old wood and the ache of work well done. And maybe that's the tragedy of progress, that we've forgotten how to build with our hands, how to think with them. Machines now do the touching for us. The connection between maker and material has thinned. We press buttons and draw lines on screens, and the timber never feels the warmth of a human palm. But those cabins remind us that there was a time when every inch of wood passed through a hand that understood it. The strength of those old walls doesn't come from engineering or design. It comes from relationship. It comes from hands that learned from frost, from bark, from sweat, from patience. Hands that trusted the slow conversation between man and material, a conversation that outlived them. If you touch one of those cabins now, just lay your fingers against the rough wood, you'll feel more than texture, you'll feel memory. The pressure of calloused palms, the rhythm of work, the pulse of life translated into craft. Those hands are gone, but their gestures remain. Every beam, every joint, every breath of the cabin sips quiet endurance is proof that the best of what we build isn't set the structure itself, but the understanding left behind in the touch that shaped it. Because the forest remembers those hands. And somewhere, in the hollow of every old cabin, so does the wind. There always comes a day when the forest reclaims what was borrowed. It never happens suddenly, never with violence, just time, patience, and quiet persistence. A roof beam begins to bow. A wall leans a little farther each spring. The moss thickens, and the floor softens under the weight of rain. At first you might think the cabin is dying, but that isn't true. What you're seeing isn't death. It's reunion, the slow, graceful return of what once was living back into the rhythm of the living world. The first to arrive are the moss and the lichen, creeping softly over the sill logs. They don't destroy. They cushion. Their roots hold moisture close, feeding the insects and worms that follow. Then the birds come, wrens, chickadees, nesting in the eaves where smoke once drifted. In spring, the grass at the doorway grows high, brushing against the threshold where boots once scraped off snow. The wind moves through the broken window frame like a sigh, carrying the scent of pine needles and decay. And inside, the air changes. What was once a man's shelter becomes part of the forest's breathing again. The chinking crumbles into soil, the bark roof collapses into mulch, and in the silence, something miraculous happens. New life takes root where the fire once burned. A sapling pushes up through the floorboards, reaching for the same light that once poured through the cabin door. The forest is not taking back what was stolen. It's completing a cycle, one the builder always knew would come. Because the mountain men never built against nature. They built with her. They knew that someday the earth would come for their work, not out of spite, but out of love. They built knowing their cabins would fall, and yet they built them anyway. That's what made them wise. They didn't chase eternity. They trusted impermanence. They understood that what matters is not how long a thing stands, but how truly it lives while it does. The cabin that once stood proud and warm will vanish, piece by piece, until only its footprint remains, a soft outline in the grass, a few stones from the hearth, a scatter of rusted nails. But the forest will remember. It will weave those memories into the roots, into the soil, into the next generation of trees, and somewhere among them, the spirit of the cabin will rise again, not as timber, but as strength, as patience, as balance. If you walk there decades later, you won't find ruin. You'll find harmony. You'll find peace. The ground will be richer for what once stood upon it. And if you listen carefully, the wind might sound different there, softer, older, like a voice speaking through the leaves. The mountain men are gone, their names buried by snow and time, but the forest keeps their promise that nothing built in respect is ever truly lost, because the earth does not erase what's made with care. It carries it forward, quietly, endlessly, until the story begins again. One day, a young traveller might stumble upon that same clearing. The path will be overgrown, the air thick with pine and the sound of distant water, and he won't even notice what's beneath his feet at first, the faint rectangle of earth where a cabin once stood. But if he looks closer, he'll see the story hidden there, the ground a little higher where the hearthstone lies buried, the grass growing greener where the logs have fed the soil. The forest has healed, but it hasn't forgotten. He kneels, brushing aside a layer of leaves, and finds a small piece of hand-hewn wood, blackened by age, light as ash. When he turns it in his palm, the shape of an old notch appears. It's smooth now, polished by rain and time, but the mark is still there, the ghost of an axe stroke made by someone long gone. And for a brief moment he understands. He feels it, the connection, the quiet reverence between man and earth, the rhythm that those who came before once lived by. He won't call it philosophy. He'll just feel it. The same pull that drew men into the mountains 200 years ago still hums beneath the roots, whispering the same truth that to live well, to build well, is to join the circle, not to stand apart from it. The wood you fell becomes warmth. The warmth becomes life. The life returns to soil. The soil feeds the trees. And the trees become wood again. Nothing ends. Everything continues. Maybe he'll camp there that night, lighting a small fire where another once burned. The smoke will rise through the same air, drift across the same valley, and mingle with the memory of every fire that came before. He'll hear the forest shift around him, branches creaking, night birds stirring, and he'll feel less alone, because somewhere in that sound there's the echo of all who once sat in that same circle of light, warming their hands, trusting the night. We like to think that progress means moving forward, that the past is something to escape, but the mountain men understood that the past isn't behind us. It's beneath us. It's the soil that everything new grows from. The wisdom we think we've outgrown is still there, waiting, buried in the grain of the wood, in the patience of the wind. And so, the circle continues. The forest takes and gives, the cabin falls and rises again in a tree. The knowledge fades and returns when someone listens closely enough to hear it. The traveller will leave in the morning, carrying that small blackened piece of wood in his pack, a fragment of the past still breathing faintly. He won't know what to call the feeling it gives him, only that it feels right, natural, eternal. And maybe that's the final lesson the mountain men left behind, that what we build with care, with hands that listen and hearts that understand, never really dies. It just changes form and waits patiently for the next set of hands to remember. Years later, the traveller will tell the story of that clearing to his children, of the forest that swallowed a cabin whole, and the piece of wood that still smelled faintly of smoke when he found it. He'll try to explain what he felt that night, but words will fail him, because how do you describe something as old as trust, something as vast and quiet as belonging? He'll simply say, it felt alive, and that will be enough. Time will move on, as it always does. Towns will grow, machines will hum, and people will forget again. Forget that wood once breathed, that houses once had heartbeats, that to build was once an act of faith, not profit. But in small, hidden places, the wisdom will remain beneath the bark, beneath the soil, beneath the hum of progress. Because the forest never stops teaching. Every fallen tree, every hollow stump, every standing ruin of a log wall is a lesson written in silence. The bark whispers about patience, that growth cannot be rushed. The roots murmur about humility, that strength means nothing without balance. The moss reminds us that decay is not the end, but the beginning of something new. The forest, in its endless stillness, keeps telling us what we once knew by instinct, that nothing alive is meant to stand apart. The mountain men didn't need teachers. Their school was the wilderness itself. They learned that you cannot own the land, only borrow it, that when you take too much, the earth answers, and that when you give back it remembers your kindness in ways that outlast centuries. Their cabins were proof of that covenant, built not to resist the wilderness, but to honor it. When the traveller's children are grown, they might one day walk into the same forest. They won't find that cabin, but they'll sense something in the air, a presence, an echo. The trees there will seem older, wiser, And perhaps, without knowing why, one of them will reach out and touch the bark of a pine and feel warmth beneath their fingers, faint but real, like the pulse of something ancient still beating. That's how the wisdom survives. Not in words, but in sensations. A smell, a sound, a touch. The world keeps it alive by tucking it away in the small moments when we stop long enough to feel it. And if those children ever build something of their own, a cabin, a home, even a life, perhaps they'll remember to leave a little space for the air to move, for the walls to breathe, for the light to change with the seasons. Perhaps they'll remember that the goal is not perfection, but harmony, because under every polished surface, beneath every layer of progress, the truth still waits, the wisdom beneath the bark, that everything living depends on its ability to bend, to breathe, to yield, and to endure, and that the most beautiful things we build are not the ones that last forever, but the ones that live long enough to become part of the earth again. There's a kind of silence that only exists in the deep woods, not the absence of sound, but the fullness of it. The rustle of leaves, the distant rush of a creek, the low creak of branches shifting in the wind. It's a silence that doesn't ask to be filled. It invites you in. And if you stay still long enough, that silence begins to shape you, the way it shaped the mountain men, the way it shaped their cabins. For in truth, silence was their greatest tool. Before the first tree fell, before the first notch was cut, there was listening. Listening to the wind, to the grain of the tree, to the unspoken rules of the land. They didn't build until they'd understood. That was the secret. That patience was the first act of craftsmanship. Modern builders start with plans. They bring noise, engines, hammers, the clatter of progress. But the mountain man began with quiet, with observation, with respect. He would walk among the trees, touching the trunks, feeling which ones leaned toward the sun, which ones had grown steady against the storm. He'd place his cabin where the snow drifted least, where the wind could pass gently around it, not through it. He wasn't forcing his will on the land. He was finding the space where his presence would fit. And that's what the silence taught him. How to listen not for what he wanted, but for what the land was willing to give. Every great act of creation begins with that same stillness, not with noise, but with attention. It's what the forest demands, and what the modern world forgets. We've filled our lives with sound, machines, voices, the endless hum of urgency. But in doing so, we've drowned out the one sound that matters most, the steady pulse of the world itself. The mountain man never forgot it, because he lived inside it. His heartbeat, his breath, the swing of his axe, all fell into rhythm with the forest. That's why his cabins still stand. They weren't built against nature, but in time with it. Every decision, where to place a door, how to angle a roof, came from silence, from waiting, from harmony. If you stand in one of those clearings now, the silence is still there. The forest holds it like a memory, gentle but unbroken. It's in the air between the trees, in the shadows that move slowly across the ground. You can feel it, even without words, the echo of attention, the residue of care. And maybe that's the final secret of the mountain men. That strength was never their greatest gift. It was stillness. The ability to stop, to listen, to understand what most people hurry past. Because silence, when treated with reverence, can build things far stronger than wood. It builds awareness. It builds patience. It builds a way of living that doesn't leave scars behind. The cabins are gone, but the silence that built them remains, drifting like smoke through the trees, waiting for the next soul brave enough to stop and listen and remember how to build again. If you linger in that silence long enough, something extraordinary happens. It begins to speak, not in words, not in language as we know it, but in rhythm and pulse and presence. The forest has its own way of telling stories. The creak of an old pine is a reminder of endurance. The whisper of birch leaves is a song about renewal. Even the wind carries memory of winters survived, of summers past, of every life that's come and gone beneath its canopy. The mountain men knew this language. They didn't try to translate it. They simply listened until they understood. The first lesson the woods ever taught them was humility. When you're alone in the wild, miles from another soul, humility isn't philosophy, it's survival. The mountain man knew that arrogance got you killed. The mountain didn't care who you were. It only cared whether you respected it. The forest could feed you or starve you, protect you or bury you. Everything depended on how well you learned to listen. And so, when he built with that respect in mind. He didn't strip the land bare. He took only what he needed. And even then, he used every piece. Bark became shingles. Roots became cords. Resin became glue. The earth gave, and he gave back in return, through care, through restraint, through gratitude. His cabin wasn't an intrusion into nature. It was a conversation with her, built in her dialect. Sometimes on still nights the cabin would creak, and he'd pause, hand hovering near the fire, and listen, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The sound wasn't danger, it was dialogue, the wood expanding, shifting, settling, alive, as it had always been. He could tell the health of his home by that voice. Too dry, and it would groan sharply. Too damp, and the sound softened into a sigh. The logs were not materials, they were companions. That's what we've lost, the ability to see our world as something that speaks back. We build walls to keep the outside out, to insulate ourselves from every whisper of the natural world. But in doing so, we lose the dialogue that kept our ancestors alive. The mountain men didn't live long by our standards, but their works have outlived them. Their cabins still stand because they were built in answer to the voice of the woods, not in defiance of it. Stand in that clearing long enough, and you can hear it again. The same murmuring the trappers heard 200 winters ago. The forest hasn't changed. It still talks in the same soft tones. The only difference is us, our ears too full of noise to hear. But if you close your eyes and let the quiet take you, it returns. The steady breathing of the trees, the hush of wind through cedar, the heartbeat of the world beneath your boots. It's not imagination, it's memory, because the voice of the woods never stopped speaking. It only waits, patiently, endlessly, for someone to listen again. And when they do, they still find what the mountain men found, that silence isn't set emptiness, that decay isn't set death, and that the forest, always forever, is trying to teach us how to live.